You're listening to a podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation. To learn more, visit cac.org.
Hey everyone, my name is Corey, and I'm part of the team that produces Everything Belongs. We wanted to let you know that this is part 3 of a 3-part series in responding to your questions that you've submitted this season. This episode in particular is just a session at Richard's Hermitage with Richard since we were cut off by the ducks being born in his front yard when we began recording this series.
Richard, thanks so much for making the time.
Of course.
We're going to interact with a few of our listeners today. Our final episode of the podcast is listener questions coming in. And so we have a few voice memos that we're going to answer. Paul and myself and our good friend Cassidy Hall chat about some of the questions. We have a few of our previous guests who phone in an answer or two, and we're super excited to chat with you about one or two of them as well.
All right.
We have a question from Mary Beth, who seeks a deeper understanding of the concept of holy desire, which you talk about in chapter 10, A Bright Sadness. And this is what she writes. During your discussion with Father Richard on chapter 10, he mentioned that without holy desire, the trajectory is not urgent, not set, not going somewhere bigger. I'm hoping that maybe you can ask him to talk more about that trajectory. So, Richard, when you talk about the trajectory of holy desire, what does that mean?
You know, I think I'm trying to go back to where my mind was when I wrote that book, but I'm trying to counter just a bit the leftover of some Buddhist teaching, which makes desire a bad word, almost a sin. Mm-hmm. We're destroyed by desire. And that's not true in the Christian tradition. Desire is more another word for the Holy Spirit. It's coterminous with energy, vitality, caring. It's an impulse forward. The opposite would be apathy.
Sure.
Or laziness, frankly.
Yeah.
So we want to see desire. I certainly know it's true in my life, especially as I get older and I don't have as much natural energy. When I do feel inner caring or excitement, I'm really grateful because I know it's on to something good.
Yeah.
It's on to caring. It's on to loving. It's on to inquiring, seeking. So as best I can remember, that's what I was trying to do, was try to counter that leftover negative connotation of the word desire. My guess is the way the Buddhists are using the word and the way the Christian mystics use the word is probably completely different.
Well, if my memory serves, I think one of the great early contemplatives, Gregory of Nyssa, talked about how humanity is created to desire and experience the love of God. And since the love of God is infinite, we are each infinite capacities for desire. So we're essentially designed to desire God forever.
You can tell he's coming from the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it seems like we get in trouble when we point that desire at the wrong things that can't satisfy it.
That's right. The desire of unlimited good or, to absolutize it, which becomes addiction. So there's such a thing as evil desire, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Quite the contrary.
One of our guests this season wrote a book called The Holy Longing, And
of
that might be a
course.
quote from Goethe. I'm not sure I remember. But she basically said the holy longing, that desire, sort of drives our spiritual quest and does get us into trouble sometimes, but it's what always brings us back and leads us forward.
I agree 100%.
At
Yeah.
81, and this would be a great way to kind of land this question, how have you experienced that guiding your life?
You know, obviously I have more time for gazing these days. I was out the last few days just sitting for an extended period. And there's a contentment that comes over me, a deep satisfaction, it feels like the opposite of longing. It feels like I've already got it. And it's having just enough of it, grace, goodness, love, charity in the heart, to know that this is so good, I want more of it.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
It's really helpful for me to hear you say that because it lets me think about the fact that there's a longing that has a degree of contentment in it.
That's my point.
Right?
Yeah.
That's great. I love
It
that.
sounds like contrary terms, but it really isn't. Holy longing is elicited, evoked by experiencing just enough of it to know this is what I want. This is good. This is everything. This is the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Oh,
Yeah.
I love that.
I've had that a lot in my gazing. Have I talked about gazing on this series?
You have, yeah. And I'm
yeah.
sure listeners could never hear you talk about it enough. It reminds me of a quote from Origen who says, "To love God and to love good things is one and the same."
Ooh.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful you have those Origin quotes at hand.
Just
to
like
love God is
Yeah.
to love everything. And to love everything is to love God. And that's why this portioning out of, well, I love other Christians or I love white people or shows, I'm afraid that the person is not yet on the right course.
Ooh, it's almost like everything belongs.
Almost like it.
That's great. That's great. Well, we have another question, Richard.
Okay.
So I'm just going to read it to you and let you tell us what you think.
Okay.
So Gail asks for clarity on the difference between God's pruning and punishment through pain. And this makes more sense in the context of her question. She says, "Hello, friends. Thank you for this engrossing season of episodes. Your guests have been well chosen and engaging, and I'll listen to the episode with Christian Wyman again. And I'm sure you won't be alone in that, Gail. Thank you. I want to believe," Gail says, "and sometimes do, that God is always merciful and does not send us pain to punish us, not even with pain tailored to our individual idolatries. I do, however, take Jesus' words about pruning branches of the vine so that they bear more fruit very seriously. And pruning sounds both individually tailored and maybe severe, even painful. Father Richard, could you please speak to the distinction between God pruning us and God sending us pain as correction?" And then she just adds this little personal bit where she says, "I'm about to undergo a painful surgery that I seem not to be able to help but think of as pruning. My condition may just be one of the accidents of living in a body, but it seems a sort of God-directed pain intended for pruning me. Because of the pain of it, I'm finding it hard to feel that as mercy." What wisdom, there's a lot in that question. What wisdom can you give for Gail?
The difference, it seems to me, is almost entirely what attitude you have toward the suffering. If you see it as God punishing you, I'm afraid it has that unfortunate effect
Wow.
of creating a distance between you and God as your nemesis, your your taskmaster, your disciplinarian. But if you see suffering as the loving, caring, I do remember this, I know it's a cliche, but I was still raised in a German farm family where discipline by spanking was common in the 40s. It was taken for granted. And my mother and my dad, even more, who was a 7, they would both say that old line, "Now this is hurting me more than it's hurting you." And they'd swat me 3 times or whatever it was. It was never abusive.
Yeah, my mom used to say that.
Yeah, it's hurting me more than it's hurting you. Now, once you really believe that about human suffering, that God is doing this not to punish me, but he's going to use it to awaken me.
Sure.
That makes all the difference.
Well, and I want to reflect on 2 things that I just heard you say. One, and this is fascinating, if we think that suffering in our life is God punishing us, we are punishing ourselves by believing
there
that.
You go.
That's
you got it.
profound.
You got it. By believing that, we're basically in a negative matrix
Wow.
of reward and punishment. I take that on a lot in my last book on the prophets. They're deeply trying to undo the entire worldview of reward and punishment, which has little value to it. But we so are trained in it that it's hard to unthink it. That life isn't all about reward. I got this because I did good.
Yeah.
I got this because I did bad. Oh.
Well, and it's so helpful then where you take us in the next bit to think it's not that God is even necessarily causing it, but that God can use it.
It's all using, yes.
He can use it to teach us. Origen says that, the great physician, we think that the flames of life destroy us, but the great physician uses the flames of life to cauterize a wound, to burn out infections, to bring us to a place of healing. And so that's intriguing. Whether it's pruning or punishing, it seems to be rehabilitative and redemptive.
Yes. In the next book on the prophets, I didn't count, but the word fire comes up somewhat frequently, but it's always, if you look at the context, the refiner's fire.
Yeah.
Refining a metal to a higher level of substance. It's never the punishing fire that we made into the fires of hell and the fires of Gehenna.
Yeah, one of the most formative moments in my education was a teacher when I was studying mythology who said that in the spiritual imagination, fire is a symbol of transformation, not destruction.
That's what I was trying to say.
That's so,
That's right.
That's great. So any advice for Gail as she navigates her surgery and her life and how to sort of hold the tension of riding the waves of that difficulty or walking through that fire, so to speak?
Gail, it'll change the nature of your prayer. It becomes instead of a begging or a fighting, it becomes a surrendering and a trusting prayer. God used this necessary pain, it seems, to teach my heart how to yield, my soul how to let go. Your prayer is much more a prayer for receptivity than for stop the pain.
Yeah.
May I learn from the pain. That changes the whole matrix of the event.
Yeah.
Of what's happening between you and God. And then when you clearly will see the fruit afterwards, I can promise you that, you'll have a God to thank, not a God to fear.
Ooh. Gosh, Richard, that sounds like guidance for the entire Falling Upward journey.
Well, I hope so. Thank you for hearing it so well.
Well, and after that, then we just have a voicemail that's come in from a listener. that I think Corey will play for us, and then Richard, you'll be able to respond, and I'm happy to chat about it with you if it provokes conversation. This is great stuff today. Thank you.
I'm Father Richard. Thank you for falling upward in this podcast. My question is this. I recently lost my father at 81 after a 2-year battle with Parkinson's and really violent dementia. And watching him suffer that and the grief of losing that, we were very close, was gut wrenching and really forced me to look at reality on reality's terms, as you say. And simultaneously, I'm watching the suffering unfold in the Middle East and Israel and Gaza. And I realized my father dying of old age, a happy, full life is a best case scenario. And with all that grief and all that recentering, I'm wondering if there are any practices or advice you could give to start building back that second joyfulness and forgiving life for being what it is and finding joy and happiness again. This is Margie from Vermont. Thank you very much.
Your attitude is so lovely already. I really don't know that I have anything to teach you. You're there already. But your humility in asking the question makes whatever answer I might try to give blessedly hearable. Well, Margie, I think you've got some of your father's spirit because there's a lot of trust in you. There's a lot of holy desire in you. He must have died a peaceful, happy death. Is that true? It's all created by our attitude toward it, by what we have become, where we are on our own journey. If we're at a place of receptivity, positivity, even the most horrible event, and certainly what's happening in Gaza is horrible. So I hate to glibly say, oh, Gazan people, just have a positive attitude. That's so naive and so easy for me to say. We can ask forgiveness of an individual for an individual event, but we can't ask, it's not my place to ask that of the collective. Those of you in Gaza, you should all forgive, or to say to all black people in America, you should not want restitution. That's too easy for me to say and too hard to expect. You can only invite the individual to rest in that place, and that won't come quickly. It won't come easily. But it is possible. And then that person becomes a yeast or a leaven in their neighborhood or in their family. But, we're now recognizing most healing is intergenerational, like what's happening in Gaza since you brought it up. My gosh, we're talking about 4 lifetimes from now. They'll still be suffering from this. But what God has to do, and God is, I'm sure, doing, is planting yeast people who, despite it all, refuse to be overcome by it. Despite it all, can still, in their deepest heart, let go, forgive, show charity to Israelis in this case. But it's a great metamorphosis of God to be able to change such suffering when we now see that it lasts from one generation to the next. It's inherited, it's contagious, it's held by a whole family system. So if I can understand that, how much God must have sympathy for that. The hard people we meet, I've met several on the streets in recent weeks, and you're tempted to just write such people off. But I have the grace now to say, if I could carry what this man is undoubtedly carrying, he wouldn't be. I've had two of them at my door here. Wouldn't be so vicious if he wasn't carrying a lot of rejection, betrayal, disappointment, self-hatred. Once you know that all negativity is created, is caused by human unkindness,
Yeah.
then why would you want to hate that person more?
Yeah.
That's the last thing they need.
Richard, I have two follow-up questions based on what you've just shared there. The first one is, I'm really moved by what you said there about yeast people. That's really profound, because we have learned so much, especially recently with the growing field of epigenetics, understanding that trauma is intergenerational
That's right.
and that hurting people hurt people.
Yes.
Is it also true then that healing people heal people? And can healing itself also be intergenerational? Like, by doing my healing work, am I contributing to the healing of my ancestors and my descendants and healing of the world?
Let me give the short answer first. Of course. And that's how life is passed on. What maybe real stupidity or sin is to be raised in a presence of loving people or forgiving people and not to accept that worldview, but to take it for granted or to think you deserve it instead of receiving it as the grace to be the wounded healer. And all healers are wounded healers. You wouldn't be a healer if you didn't have a wound to heal.
It's true. That's true. In the second episode of this season's podcast, I think it was the second episode, I was talking to Kirsten Oates and Patrick Boland. We were talking about the hero's journey. And for the first time, the conversation that I'd had earlier with you led me to wonder if it's, at least for me, more helpful to think about being on a healer's journey, where doing my healing allows me to put that healing in the service of healing
That's
the world.
a nice phrase, the healer's journey. Yeah. Which is simply handing on what was handed to me undeservedly. Why is it I don't seek revenge or restitution? Why? Where did that come from? Now what I want to do is let other people know that, experience that, feel that, the non-desire for revenge. Why do some people have that?
Yeah.
And then when you hear politicians speaking of retribution, you have, again, a yeast person,
Yeah.
but negative yeast.
Yeah.
I'm going to help you.
Well, and I think about on our road.
Retribute, that's not a word, is it? I'm not,
Retribution?
Yeah. I'm going to help you pay back. Yeah.
Well, I wonder about, my second question is, on our journey to becoming yeast people and becoming healers, what I hear in our questioner is when bombs are falling and the world's on fire, it's hard to give yourself over to the grief of just one loss. And yet, listening to her talk about the loss of her father, thinking about the loss of my mom, who died when she was not much older than I am, who died a very painful death. You know, death becomes such a difficult and devastating doorway.
Yeah.
Right?
Ooh. Good choice of word.
Yeah, and there's an initiation and a breaking open of the heart in that regardless of what's going on in the world, I still think deserves its due, yeah? How does that initiate us into, the interrelationship between great love and great suffering?
The utterly nonsensical experience of the death of anything we have loved. You have to have admired it, loved it, bonded with it first, or it won't become a teacher. And the teaching comes when what you have loved is then gone. Gate, utterly gone. The nonsensicalness of that haunts you for days, weeks, months after anybody you've loved or anything you've loved. I have little Opie here on my lap right now, and I'm looking straight out at the tomb of my previous dog in my front yard, and I still miss her.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky to have this one to take her place. But boy, the idea of things being gone, gone, utterly gone.
Yeah.
I'm quoting the Heart Sutra of Buddhism, which is the final words, gate, parasam gate.
I remember my dad
Excuse me.
talking about the book of Job. In the book of Job, he loses his children. And at the end of the story, God gives him back twice as much wealth of everything he's lost. Twice as many children are returned. And I remember my dad said, when he read that story at first, he read it one way, and then he lost the child. And it forever changed his reading, because he said, God may have given him more children, but they weren't the same children.
The same.
That loss never
Your
quite
dad
goes
said
away.
that too.
Yeah.
Wow. You have to earn the right to say that.
Yeah.
I don't think I've experienced that kind of. The grief of losing a child is apparently like nothing else. Parents you expect. Grandparents you have had time to prepare for. But a child's death is always a tragedy. Yeah.
When I think about our guests like Paula D'Arcy this season and Mirabai Starr, who both lost children,
Both.
and how that shattered their heart. And this is my last question for you. How can that heart-shattering open our hearts? How can that increase our capacity for love? Can it?
I think it's the natural movement if you allow what I call in my next book the tears of things. You have to allow sadness to intervene with your resentment, your resistance, your anger. And the field of just deep sadness softens. It doesn't harden, it softens. That's the function of what the mystics called holy tears.
Yeah.
And why Jesus said, blessed are, how happy are those who weep. So the field of tears is the transformative field from anger and resentment to compassion and charity. And you yourself don't know how it happened. You didn't make it, but I suddenly don't feel a need for retribution. I know that all sadness is deserved. Everything is crying, which is why I use that word, the tears of things, from Latin literature. Everything is crying. Everything experiences its own impending death, its own inevitable death.
And yet somehow that's not a defeat.
It's not a what?
Defeat.
No, that's it. how do you get to that point? Tears get you there. When you lament the human situation rather than feel it's my job to change it. You'll start there, of course. I have to change it or fix it or understand it. And you can't. You weep over it. You're in a different transformative field when you weep over it. Over time, not in 1 5-minute period. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Richard, it has been such a great journey over these over a dozen episodes to talk about falling upward with you, to engage our listeners, to bring in different conversation partners. As we bring this journey to a close, I wonder if you would offer a falling upward prayer for our listeners to kind of offer a blessing for all of us as we continue to take this journey in our own lives and live out what we've learned about.
All right, it has to be given to me. I'll just start and trust it'll be given. God of all mercy, make us merciful. God of all lamentation, teach us to weep as you did over Jerusalem and over Lazarus and over yourself in the Garden of Gethsemane. Help us not to remain angry for very long, only enough to open up the deep wells of the heart. We thank you for what falling has already taught us and what it still has to teach us. And you taught us by falling in the dramatic image of Jesus falling, that even the Son of God was not separate from falling. And that's what we call transformation and resurrection. We wait for it, we ask for it, we trust it when it comes. May we trust it when it comes. And we offer our prayer together and in all of the names of God, because we know it is always in the end a gift. I can't force this attitude even in myself. You have to give it to me. I want it. I want it ahead of time. I need it deeply. Amen.
Thanks for listening to this podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation, an educational nonprofit that introduces seekers to the contemplative Christian path of transformation. To learn more about our work, visit us at cac.org. Everything Belongs is made possible thanks to the generosity of our supporters and the shared work of
Mike Petro,
Paul Swanson,
Jenna Kuiper,
Izzy Spitz,
Megan Hare,
Sarah Palmer,
Barb Lopez,
Brandon Strange,
and me, Corey Wayne. The music you hear is composed and provided by our friends Hammock. And we'd also like to thank Sound On Studios for all of their work in post-production. From the high desert of New Mexico, we wish you peace and every good.
Do you feel called to walk a more contemplative path? The Center for Action and Contemplation is an educational nonprofit supporting the journey of inner transformation. Our programs and resources will help grow your consciousness, deepen your prayer practice, and strengthen your compassionate engagement with the world. Learn more about our resources, such as publications, podcasts, email series, and events at www.cac.org.